So welcome to the Secure Dynamics TechCast. With me, I have one past guest and one new guest. Past guest is Ty Spano, who is the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Sisense. And my new guest is Ray Espinoza, who's the Head of Security at Cobalt. Welcome, Ty. Welcome, Ray.
How's it going?
Thank you.
So the topic is ransomware, right? Which is clearly, it has been making the rounds, but off late, it certainly seems to have elevated in stature. So question to you, Ray. From a SME's perspective, right? By the way, I figured out you can actually do remote chiropractic too. I don't know how they do that, right? But it's these businesses that are going digital for the first time, right? And they have a hard enough time trying to keep the business up and running, but they're collecting a lot of data as well, right? So talk about, like, if I were to approach you as the head of a chiropractic practice and say, hey, Ray, you need to talk about data security and encryption keys and S3 buckets and all that, you don't have time for me. So how does a SME come to terms with this highly potent form of attack that actually take the business down literally overnight?
Absolutely. Thankfully, it's the question hopefully shouldn't be that far off, as any of these small businesses have been adopting technology slow and over time, whether they manage their own email systems previously or they're running a website or something else. Some of the same types of threats in phishing and malicious software, those aren't necessarily new, thankfully. And so that's typically been used to bridge that conversation. Ransomware is another really bad outcome that can happen that is typically delivered through phishing, again, nowadays, but is essentially something that can bring your business to a slow crawl. And by helping at least understand the impact, you talk at that level, as opposed to focusing on, again, if I came to somebody and said, are you doing encryption on your S3 buckets, and, are you doing logging, or they go into your SIM, they're going to look at me crazy and say, what the heck are you talking about? But when you start talking about, typical mitigating controls of endpoint security and secure email gateways, at least you're helping them understand, like, that phishing threat is the existential threat to all of us, and it has been for some time. And I found sort of starting there to help them come to grips is an easier point to jump off and say, and then ransomware can actually turn bad by doing this, by holding all of your files hostage and looking for some sort of outcome from you. I find at least it's a little bit of an easier approach, and it's less of this huge bridge to get across, as opposed to, again, securing your cloud infrastructure, who maybe they've outsourced that to a provider. Ty, what are your thoughts on that? How does that resonate with you?
I think it makes sense. I think from my standpoint, I don't want to unpack all the controls that could go into protecting against ransomware, but I agree, training is one of them. My experience has led more down the path of, let's look at the past 6 months, maybe 8 months of data, how people are feeling. And I can tell you Q2, how many people were burnt out. I was pretty burnt out in Q3. I'm in Q4. I feel a little bit better, but it's been a long year, right? 2020 has been tougher than before. And I think even internal to our metrics, we did phishing tests as part of it. We used to see about a 3% click rate. So we build our controls around impact likelihood, and then risk management falls into natural play with that discussion. But when it comes to phishing, we actually saw an increase, a dramatic increase to 16%. We actually pulled back, made some adjustments, adjusted how we do phishing and spam protection all throughout Q2, and pulled back on our own training and anti-phishing controls. Where I like to focus on in protection of these, in discussion with the organization and our leadership team here at Sisense, do we know where all of our endpoints are? Do we have asset inventory? When we start with hygiene of where that's at, then we can start getting down to now, okay, antivirus, anti-malware. But really, for me, it's the concept that these devices we're on are disposable. And then I like certain products that are out there that are less intelligent products, where it's just like a very cheap device that you can connect to. But it's more the mindset. I want people to think about, don't keep too much on the actual local assets that you're dependent on. Make sure that you work in that mindset. Make sure you have MFA everywhere. It's all these basic hygiene practices. So we take the stress away from the end user and just say, hey, we're going to protect you the best we can, but here's where we need your help. Use cloud services that we authorize. Don't use random cloud services. And I think once you start shifting that mindset of more that cloud native experience, you have less risk, because if there's nothing on the system and it gets crypto locker and they're like, we need 3 Bitcoin. I'm like, that's fine. Let it go, throw it out, just take it. snap it in half and then ship it to our IT team. We'll take care of the rest. We'll do forensics on it.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, just the whole disposable aspect of things, because that you say everything is replaceable, so therefore the less you put, the better. So coming on to a much more hot button topic, right, which is to report or not to report, right? And if you are falling victim to a ransomware attack, how do you respond? I'll start with you, Ty, in terms of, is it, I mean, do you go to legal first, do you go to PR, do you go to marketing, do you go to the Department of Treasury, do you go to cyber insurance? I mean, there are 20 different options, right? So what does a CISO do?
Well, one, I hope you have a plan. I hope you have an incident response plan already well documented that addresses this, because it will happen. You're going to have malware, you're going to have viruses, you're going to have exploits run, you're going to have malicious code that's just not even signed running on systems that may not be classified as malware with signatures that you need to have that just aren't there. I think when you have that defined process, you know where to escalate to. And if you're talking about a single endpoint with no data, what's there to report? But if it's an endpoint with a key engineer that has keys to everything and customers' data, and they were forced to take customers' data to look at it, well, it's a much different discussion, right? And I think that engagement with legal, one, have a healthy relationship with your general counsel and your legal specialists and the folks that write all the contracts, because I think they're some of your best advocates and partners when it comes to those deals, because what is it listed in each contract that says you must do something? And Ashwin, I wish we could all agree to what those consistent contractual terms are, because Ray, I don't know how you live, but we manage by Redline, with our legal team, because everyone wants to use their paper, especially in their Fortune 500 or Fortune 100. So it makes it unique and challenging. And I still look for this solution of how and who do we need to notify? Because sometimes folks will write language of if you suspect an incident versus you get a breach of specific data. So it does come back to like, what do we agree to in the terms there? For my experience, I just make sure here's our bar. Actually, I'm not going to say I care as much as what's lower, but I'm going to hold it to when we reasonably believe to have some sort of compromise or issue. Then we start going down that path of engaging legal, and usually with the data protection addendum or legal languages that we see today, you have 48 hours. We try to make that 24, but it varies. It just depends on the nature of the service, what product they're using, and then what type of data do they even have. But again, if I'm holding that bar at the right place, we just make it the consistent expectation. I'm shooting for 24 hours the second anything starts. So Ray, that's when, gone in 24 hours is kind of the stress, right? Like I have to make sure that that timer, once I know, and my team knows that we're cranking away as fast as we can to understand, do we need to involve and report? And then we go from there.
Hey, Ray, so I'm going to add something and then ask you for your perspective, right? Which is one of the things I go back to Equifax, what was it, 7-8 years ago, right? And Capital One after that. So the list goes on in terms of how big is the scope? How much is actually compromised? Is it a bluff attack versus real? I mean, so I know, Ty, you mentioned 24-48 hours. So Ray, I mean, how do you, how does the 24-48 hours manifest itself? Is like all hands on deck? Are you like shooting in the dark? I mean, what is the best practice and what is really happening?
I mean, Ty said it best, and it comes down to having a defined process and working through that process. And more importantly, you get to build some sort of muscle memory by doing tabletop exercises and testing these specific scenarios. I know we've done these types of scenarios here at Cobalt here over the last year, so much so that we've done 3 or 4 in the past 12 months so that it becomes that muscle memory. It takes a lot of the guesswork out when stress is extremely high of what do we do, who's going to do it, and who do we notify? And we really try to be as prescriptive as necessary to drive a consistent outcome, but still allow enough flexibility so that we can take in some of those different variables and take the right action. We feel like folks are backed into a corner here. But regardless of what it is, it's still that clock that you're racing against, and you really are hoping that everybody who's going to be involved from the notification perspective to your initial triage, they all have a general understanding of how things work, how this information came in, and then it's up to myself or the other incident manager or somebody else on the team to figure out, well, what's that window that we're working with? What's that sort of timestamp that has started this 24-hour clock, and who's affected and what the blast radius looks like, and then what do we do from there? That's been really the best way for us to do that, is just continue to test and think through these specific scenarios and then force ourselves to figure out, well, things aren't always going to work out the way we expect. Historically, I ran tabletop exercises where we work through, okay, this specific issue happened. Now what are you going to do? And they're like, oh, well, I'll pull these logs and I'll do forensics and I'll do this. And then we've now, through working with folks like Hackback Gaming, you have this game element to it of like, well, you roll the dice and you figure out your logs just aren't there, or you know, the provider you use for forensics is on vacation, and so now what do you do? And forcing them to think through some of those those activities that are going to be outside of their control. It makes it a little bit more real and a little bit better, and we're just that much better at being able to respond appropriately. But we also still err on the side of transparency as much as possible. If we start to get close to that clock, we're just going to be as open and honest and transparent of here's where we are, here's what we know, and here's who we believe is affected. Because I'd hate to get beyond that point and find out, well, geez, we just didn't do a great job in being able to communicate as clearly and as timely as we needed to.
Okay,
So
final. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It's stressful, period. So that's the takeaway.
Yeah, and I can just imagine, right? So last question, lightning round, right? As I was researching for this conversation, I was searching for ransomware as a service and ran into this thing called Philadelphia ransomware. There's a freaking YouTube video, right? Actually telling you, hey, this is what you need to do to run a ransomware attack. So are you, I mean, again, I'm just looking, is this something that you guys also use to truly understand how the attackers are behaving as well to get one step ahead of them? Or is it really realizing that you have enough, like you said, Ty, there's enough stress out there, so let's focus on the defenses? Or do you actually kind of try to understand the enemy's mentality?
I think for this one, you know, it's no different. I've been doing security for about 14, 15 years now. You know, cyber laws and extradition rates aren't global. So there are countries where you look at like this Philadelphia ransomware. I lived there for 4 years. You know, Philly's a special place, but why you would call that ransomware Philadelphia is beyond me. I've seen a lot more anime rising, which I really appreciate. Now, back to the actual topic. This has been a legitimate business model in the Eastern Bloc, Asia. Like, there's just a lot of places where people can go and have legitimate businesses to literally, sometimes you see some of these APT, advanced persistent threat groups, and these actors where literally they're 8 o'clock to the 5 o'clock. They're doing a lot of active hacking. They're trying to pivot. They're trying to gain. They're getting a foothold. And maybe they even have a follow the sun model where they pass it to another country where they're partnering with. The advancement of the maturity of how these organizations work now is sometimes, I'm going to say sometimes even better than our teams, because we have the limitations of time, money, energy. And Ray and I have been working, you know, these 24-hour things back to back. We get tired.
Yeah.
But when you have an army of people that you can hire left and right, and you have no people officer, you have no legal counsel, you can do whatever you want as frequently, as aggressive as you want. And I think that's really the difference, is we're fighting this, that's the definition, advanced persistent threat. So yeah, I don't think the struggles change that much. It's the different forms, you know, different governments are working together to try and take some of these down, but those botnets, they're gone in, you know, 60 seconds, 60 days. It really just depends on how much they can automate. And I think we've seen the use and rise of cloud-based services that make our jobs even tougher. So when I get those malicious IPs or those, you know, indicators of compromise, and they're talking to a service and it's AWS, and I can't tell, is it a customer's AWS environment that we're legitimately connecting through, or is it something that's malicious because I've got an indicator on it? So the benefit for us is now that we're, as a community, working more closely together, there are more legit services. We can get this intel a little bit better than we used to be able to. The hard part is IPv6, the change with how domains are being managed, certs being stolen all the time. So sometimes it may just be legitimate traffic to a legit website because someone took their legit cert. So the challenge is higher, the bar is definitely higher, but the response time for us, again, if we have a plan, we can work through these things. And if you have the right team that you're surrounded by with the right ethics and integrity as a security practitioner, you work through it.
Ray, final thoughts?
I would say that the barrier to entry to being a malicious threat actor is absolutely lower. And so, you know, we think through just a quantity of attacks that can come out of this. You don't have to be a hacker. You don't have to have great skill. You just need a few fraction of Bitcoin to go out and buy a tool or lease this service. and conduct it on whatever you're most interested in. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the same security basics, security hygiene, and then testing your response plan. If there's repeatability to that, we're going to be able to do our best to be able to respond. There's always variables and things that we just didn't think about. That's when we really earn our stripes, there at the company and trying to help us get through those types of issues. But a lot of it is raising awareness as well of everybody wants to get plugged into, well, let's get some threat intel and let's try to figure out who's really behind this. And it's like, well, if it's not an advanced persistent threat group where we're going to get a really good understanding of what they're truly after, do we gain anything by understanding that it's a kid in his basement in Minnesota? Probably not. But it just brings us back to being able to operationalize and respond the best that we can.
Cool. Again, thanks for your time. Great conversation. I'm sure we'll have more topics to talk about in the future. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Ty, for your time.
Thank you.